Back with me, Ayman Mohyeldin, MSNBC anchor, Cal Perry, NBC News global editor, Nayyera, former State Department senior advisor, Malcolm Nance, executive director of the Terror Asymmetrics Project. Ayman, I'll start with you. What I didn't hear in that, attacked in two cities, Homs and in Damascus, near Damascus, a facility that seems to have been a research facility, 29 bombs dropped on another facility. What I didn't hear were attacks on any personal assets related to Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of Syria, or attacks on the Syrian military.
Yeah, this was, if you had to look at a spectrum of possible options presented to the president, and a lot of analysts who have been following this and tracking this over the last several weeks would probably say this falls on the end of the spectrum that would be classified as a very limited operation. If you wanted to go to the opposite end of the spectrum, let's say if you wanted to go where John Bolton perhaps wanted the president to go, it would have involved strikes on the regime's capability to deliver those weapons, which would have been fixed-wing aircraft or helicopters or airports. It could have gone on the command and control structure of the defense establishment, the security establishment, headquarters, barracks, things like that. Could have even gone after the presidential palace to really disrupt the president of Syria's ability to still kind of keep the country and keep the command and control of his military cohesively together. Any chance of doing that? You could have gone after the port in Latakia as well. But that falls on the very serious end of the spectrum, which I don't think this president, from the tweets that he had been suggesting, right, from the politics of what he's facing here domestically, from the international community's willingness to get involved and mirror down in that kind of conflict, I don't think the president was anywhere near that part of the spectrum. So what we saw, 3 strikes, very limited, or 3 targets, I should say, very limited in scope. And the Pentagon is probably has a little bit more wishful thinking that this is going to work as a deterrent. Last year, when they went after 1 strike, it did not deter President Assad. And let's keep in mind that although we are now involved in a military strike April of 2018, I believe there have been 9 other chemical weapons attacks over the course of the past 12 months that went without any kind of response from the United States militarily.
Yeah, I mean, we have the August 2013 attack on rebels in a city called Ghouta. We have an April 4th, 2017 attack. We have an April 6th attack. So there have been multiple attacks, and we haven't responded to each of them. So then, you know, that Cal, I'm struck by that imagery by our Bill Neely of the dictator of Syria, the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, just strolling out and saying, this did nothing to me. I don't understand what message was even sent in the region, where the idea is you're supposed to scare him straight, right? I wonder if we did that, or did we just make him more defiant? And by the way, if we did what Ayman was just talking about, you risk a conflict with Iran and Russia, which clearly the United States doesn't want.
Right. So on the one side, as Ayman was saying, you either risk a conflict widening, right? But on the flip side now, you've given the Syrian president and the Syrian government the leeway to come out today and say, we were victorious, we were able to stop this strike, and push forward that propaganda campaign. The contradictions here, right, are incredible. President Trump wants us out of Syria, yet 150-some-odd missiles, right? He wants to help the people of Syria, yet only 11 Syrians have been led into the United States this year. So we're running like a 15-to-1 missile-to-refugee ratio. 500,000 Syrian civilians killed, 500,000 people. Where have we been the last 7 years if we really care about the Syrian people? This is what the Arab world is saying this morning, and the Arab world is very politically astute. They're going to be saying this is a president who's under serious domestic political challenges and is wagging the dog.
Yeah, and the reality is, Malcolm, I'm old enough to remember when an American president made a really sort of heart-wrenching case for attacking another Ba'athist dictatorship in the region, like right next door, by saying that, you know, the then dictator of Iraq was killing and gassing children, that we had to go in there for humanitarian reasons. That didn't end well. Donald Trump was actually declared himself for invading Iraq and then turned against it, ran on this idea that he wouldn't get us into that sort of land war debacle. But here we find ourselves. Is there a rational military explanation or an intelligence explanation for doing what we did yesterday if we've already stated that the goal is not to change the regime? Malcolm.
Oh, okay. Well, no, I was so stunned by that question that I couldn't speak. No, there is no rational reason for that, because there's no strategy. Strategy involves long-term planning so that when you do something, you understand the consequences of what was done, and then what you have to do is manage those consequences. We are not doing that. What we are doing is flailing about. And as much as I like carrying out an airstrike against people that really deserve it, that's precisely what we have here. We went out, we struck the organizational infrastructure of the chemical weapons, but we did nothing to present a threat to the regime itself. Excuse me.
No, no worries. I know you were up all night because we had you essentially captive at MSNBC all night. You know, Nayyera, I want to talk about the sort of diplomatic issue here, because with Iraq, what you had was a struggle with the Bush administration, with the George W. Bush administration, to create an international coalition and a consensus that we even ought to attack that country. I remember France being on the other side of that issue, hence freedom fries and other attacks on France as an entity, and Britain going along with us, sort of always riding alongside whenever we want to attack countries in that region. But I wonder if this time what's missing is any sort of diplomatic effort to isolate Bashar al-Assad the way, for instance, we isolate North Korea. Is he a rogue regime being treated by the rest of the world in that way? I mean, this is a country that wants to isolate Iran. We want to isolate North Korea. What can the international community do diplomatically about Assad? I mean, his wife is still shopping in Paris, as last time I checked.
Sure. I mean, Assad is defiant, and he has been for the last 7 years, which is especially horrific, knowing that he's actually a doctor by training, yet he decides that he needs to be killing children in his own country. He is backed by some serious powers, unlike North Korea, right? So it really requires, as Donald Trump, for the first time in this entire war, mentioned directly that Iran and Russia are the ones backing up the Assad regime. But these are just moments in which he decides that he wants to appeal to some common sensibility versus anything, as Malcolm and others we've all mentioned, any long-term strategy, right? It took a year for Donald Trump to implement the sanctions that Congress had put on Russia for interfering in our election. What is he actually going to do to get to the heart of Assad's power? And that is the Russian regime. Additional sanctions, is he going to take Putin on directly? I mean, unfortunately, by not intervening directly after a chemical attack that first time around last year, it was fancy fireworks then, it's fancy fireworks now, where he signals like crazy what he's going to do, so everybody pulls out, we bomb empty buildings. It's not the true deterrent that you would hope for to give Assad. So it ends up being a tit for tat, in which he gets to show something to his base or people in the United States who want to feel good about a humanitarian intervention without any of the actual practical steps of following up against Russia or any of the humanitarian steps of letting in refugees. This is the additional challenge we have then. If he's not going to take on Russia, he's not really making a case to the American public either, which is what you need to do in a wag the dog scenario. There is no long-term plan for selling the American public on why we should be interfering in Syria. So again, it just ends up being a temporary, momentary distraction, which is ultimately what all of his tweets are. They are temporary distractions. They are not policy statements or policy deliverables.
Right. And when you're so loose with the truth as the U.S. president, as he is on Twitter, and you're so bombastic, you open the door for the Russians to say whatever they want because nothing really matters and it's all noise. So the Russians said the Syrians were behind the chemical attack, the rebels. They set it up. The Russians said, this ex-spy in the UK who was poisoned, it was the Brits. It was all a staged event. Yeah. It creates so much noise, and at the end of the day, today, the Russian military is more entrenched, and they've just said to the world, we can stay here, and we're a deterrence to the United States.
Really quickly, Malcolm, before I come back to the table, Bashar al-Assad is backed by two regimes that we are supposedly sanctioning. Russia, which Donald Trump keeps reluctantly sanctioning, which he finally said something negative about, and Iran, which Donald Trump claims he wants to tear up an agreement to stop them building nuclear weapons. I don't understand why it is so complicated. If these are two countries the world already seems prone to isolate them all.
Yeah, well, you know, this is a question of will also. I mean, Iran and Russia right now in Syria, take a look at this. They are creating an axis where Russia has extended Iran's influence all the way up to the Israeli border, has given them the ability to expand their ground forces, armed forces, combat capability in Syria to keep that regime in place, to further Russia's goals. In doing that, none of the sanctions that we're implementing, which are generally personal, are impacting Russia. Russia is more than willing to wink and nod at the arms regime that we put in place for the weapon, controlling Iranians' weapons program. But they are selling things to them, and what they're selling first is weapons. And in selling those weapons, we are now giving Iran and Russia everything that they've ever wanted. Since we did nothing yesterday.
I wouldn't worry as much about a conventional response from Russia, like a missile tit for tat, as much as using their new tool of disinformation. And that's where, they're going to try to continue to destabilize democracies outside of Syria, in the West and in the United States.
And really quickly, can you put that map back up, please? Okay, because Ayman, we already essentially handed Iran Iraq. Right? We went in and invaded Iraq and handed it over to the more pro-Shiite government, which then is friendly with Iran. Now we have Syria, which is essentially under the control of Iran and Russia. And then Trump has been empowering Russia from the minute he became president of the United States. Do we even have any significant influence in that region anymore, or have we essentially now ceded it to Russia and Iran?
I think if you were to look at where the United States has influence, it's pockets in the region among some Gulf Arab countries, perhaps more so than anywhere else. You have certainly influence with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, but let's be clear, they don't necessarily have influence enough to change Saudi Arabia's policies on issues like Yemen and elsewhere. So I'm not sure that the United States has the kind of influence that it once used to have. What we've seen masterfully from the Iranians is they've exploited all of the American missteps in the region. You look at, for example, the Iraq war you mentioned, that was one. The Syria war, that's another. But look at even more recently, the GCC conflict. You've got the United States embroiled in this tension between Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. And what has happened? Iran has gotten closer to one of the closest GCC countries that the United States used to be close with, which is Qatar. Why? Because President Trump, by some accounts, threw Qatar under the bus early on in this dispute, if you will. And so Iran has gotten closer to Qatar, and once again, it is exploiting the vulnerabilities of the United States' missteps. And I think that's a sign that the United States has not had a clear strategy in the region that to be honest, predates President Trump, but has gotten worse since President Trump.
It's gotten worse since President Donald Trump, and Mr. Tough Guy just had Qatar's emir sitting in the White House.
As if nothing was wrong.
As if nothing was wrong, having changed nothing about his relationship with Iran, still pals with Iran, back in the White House. I would love to know why. And I'd also still like to know where Jared Kushner got that $1.2 billion for 666 Fifth Avenue. I'm going to keep asking that question because I'm curious. Curiosity. Ayman Mohyeldin, Cal Perry, Nayyera Hawk, Malcolm Nance. Malcolm, get some sleep. Coming up, the imperial power of the American presidency is next.